This is just the beginning.
Welcome to this Axios virtual event, Equal Justice, a bipartisan push to end the disparity in drug criminalization. I'm Mike Allen, a co-founder of Axios, and I'm coming to you from Axios HQ in Arlington, Virginia. I don't get to come in here very often. I'll be joined shortly by my colleague, Russell Contreras, Axios Race and Justice reporter. We'd like to thank the Justice Action Network for making these conversations possible, and thank you for joining us across all the platforms of Axios events. We'd love for you to follow along on Twitter at Axios with the hashtag Axios events. Our first two guests show what a bipartisan issue this is. A House Democrat, a House Republican. You don't see that too often. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York, who's chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, and Congressman Kelly Armstrong of North Dakota, represents the whole state and brings the view of a former criminal defense attorney. It's a bipartisan tableau. It tells the story. Congressman Jeffries, Congressman Armstrong, welcome to Axios.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Congressman Jeffries, I'm going to start with you. And if I'm brand new to this issue of the disparities in sentencing on drug crimes, why should I care? Make it vivid for me.
Well, we have an overcriminalization and mass incarceration epidemic in America that has been fueled by the failed war on drugs. When President Nixon launched the war on drugs approximately 50 years ago in 1971, when he declared drug abuse public enemy number one, there were less than 300,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, there are 2.3 million. Disproportionately African American and Latino, and a significant number of those individuals who have been incarcerated over the years are there for non-violent drug offenses. America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, including per capita China and Russia combined. It's a stain on our democracy. And that's been fueled by the failed war on drugs and the disparate sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine has been a substantial part at the federal level of the overcriminalization issue that we have in America, which hurts individuals, it hurts families, it hurts communities, and it ultimately hurts the taxpayers as well. Because it is an inefficient use of resources. And that is why I'm so thankful for the partnership with Representative Armstrong. And I expect that as with other criminal justice issues, we will be able to approach this in a strongly bipartisan way and continue to make progress on behalf of the American people.
Congressman Armstrong, you saw this up close and personal as a defense attorney. You saw people's lives turned out inside out by this. Tell us what you learned, like on that day-to-day level.
Well, I think first of all, what you learned is if you're going to commit a crime, commit a state crime and not a federal crime. And I think that's one of the things, whether it's the disparity in sentencing or ever. When I was practicing, 5 grams of crack cocaine would get you a 5-year minimum mandatory in federal court and in federal prison. I think it's up to 28 now. But the reality is you're doing this based on sentencing guidelines. So you're almost always extending off of that minimum mandatory sentence. The vast majority of the people who commit this crime are between the age of 18 and 25. You're going to already, if you're dealing with this in federal court, they're going to come out of prison whenever they come out of prison as a felon, which means their likelihood of reoffending already goes up. And just a simple fact of the matter is if you're going to lock people up for unbelievably disproportionate amount of times in a federal penitentiary, of which until recently you had to serve 85%, you're teaching them how to be better criminals and not be better members of society. And that's what we really want to do, right? We want to be able to get them out. We want to break the cycle of addiction. We want to break the cycle of addiction for their families. And we want to get them back in and helping in doing that. And this is a big part going forward.
Congressman Jeffries, you were born in Brooklyn. You're very close to your district. You have these conversations with your constituents. Maybe tell us about one particular case that would really bring this issue alive for our guests.
Well, as Representative Armstrong indicated, the original disparity was 100 to 1. in the context of the amount of time that you would serve for a crack cocaine offense as compared to a powder cocaine offense, notwithstanding the fact, Mike, that there is no pharmacological difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine as it impacts the body. I've always wanted to use that word, pharmacological. I can't spell it necessarily, but I know what it means. There's no chemical difference in terms of how the body reacts. And so the disparity has been particularly devastating in inner city communities or in rural communities in parts of Appalachia in the context of the adverse impact that the disparate sentencing has had in devastating fashion. And, you know, growing up and coming of age in Brooklyn in the midst of the crack cocaine epidemic, I can tell you that I've just seen countless lives ruined without a meaningful investment in trying to help individuals successfully return to society. As the Congressman indicated, you send them to federal prison for these extended sentences. You're teaching them how to be better criminals, not productive citizens in our society.
Congressman Armstrong, when you were on the Judiciary Committee, you worked with Congressman Jeffries on this issue. And I can tell you it's a pretty short list of issues where the parties are working together these days. What is it about this issue that has brought Republicans, Democrats together for bipartisan action, something actually even signed into law?
I think actually a lot of it is often the case out here. You know, our local law enforcement, our local probation officers at the state and county level have actually done a really good job of recognizing addiction as a disease more than just simply a crime. And states, liberal states, conservative states, Republican legislatures, Democratic-led legislatures have been doing criminal justice reform at the state level. And it's heartening to me because I think that's the point, right? We're not talking about not holding people accountable for their actions. Of course, we should hold people accountable for their actions. But really, are we? I mean, we're not in a place where we should be sending people to 35 years in prison for a first-time offense on a nonviolent crime. I mean, just that old adage. I'm really proud of a lot of people all across the country from both stripes that have started to recognize, you know, addiction's a disease, and we have to do a better job of treating it while holding people responsible. But it's important for us, right? Because even though most of law enforcement is delivered at the state and local level, a lot of states utilize federal sentencing guidelines, federal regulations as a baseline for how they do their sentencing. So even though we might not touch as many of them as other people, it's really important that we're tackling these issues. And there is no reason that it was 100-1. Quite honestly, there's no reason it's 18-1. It's like it was a compromise to get it passed. I'm glad that happened, but it's time to get rid of it because what Congressman Jeffries said is 100% right.
Congressman Jeffries, two-parter here. On the first step, criminal justice reform legislation that you championed and that was signed into law, two things. One, what is your optimism that there will be a second step? And second, what did you learn about working across the aisle, how a Democrat could work with a Republican on this particular issue?
Well, that's the wonderful thing about criminal justice reform is that it is an incredibly bipartisan issue. And the First Step Act brought together the left and the right, progressives and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, the NAACP and the Koch brothers, the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation, all points in between, ultimately able to get a bill out of the House and the Senate and signed into law by President Trump. What I learned is that when you can pull together a coalition of the unusual suspects who agree on an issue related to criminal justice reform for different reasons, of course, our notions of equal protection under the law, liberty and justice for all, wanting to make sure that we efficiently use taxpayer dollars not wasted on the prison industrial complex, the notion amongst the religious community in redemption, and also the perception correctly amongst many libertarians that government overreach is particularly damaging when it can take away your life and your liberty. And we've seen that with respect to the failed war on drugs and these harshly punitive sentences. Those are still foundational values that will enable us to continue to work on criminal justice reform with respect to the Equal Act and with respect to taking additional steps to strike out against overcriminalization in America.
And Congressman Armstrong, we're about to get the hook here, so I can ask you this super quick. Congressman Jeffries mentioned churches. What are the roles of some of the other outside players? So business, victims' rights groups, law enforcement, faith-based groups. Like what role do they play in this concert?
I think very simply, when they support projects like this, it makes it easier for other people, whether it's a local sheriff, local prosecutor, local county commissioner, to get behind this, right? Because there's never been a place where the policy and the politics diverged quicker. Nobody ever lost an election being tough on crime. Nobody, and particularly when it's a local state's attorney or a local sheriff. But we have realized that has failed over the last 40 years. All it does is increase our incarceration and increase our recidivism, which I think is the second part of this. So those groups play a huge role in recognizing that there are better ways to do this. We don't have to be soft on crime. We just have to be smarter about how we deal with this, particularly with young adults, usually young men, oftentimes disproportionately minorities. And there's a way to do this better. And that's why I'll work on this with everything. I actually miss Congressman Jeffries on judiciary right now.
That's the tweet. You never lost an election by being tough on crime, and that has failed. As we say goodbye, and I'm going to have Congressman Jeffries go first, Congressman Armstrong have the last word. We always end on a more human note, one fun thing. So I'd like to ask each of you, in COVID shutdown, what's changed about your workout routine, your family routine? What's been big for you the last year? Congressman Jeffries?
Well, let me say, we certainly miss Representative Armstrong on judiciary as well. And that's been a great tradition of working across the aisle with members like Trey Gowdy and Doug Collins and Jason Chaffetz. And Representative Armstrong has continued that tradition, even though he's moved over to Energy and Commerce. For me, it's been the opportunity just to sit down and have family dinners on a regular basis with our two teenage boys, which was probably few and far between pre-COVID, and has been an incredible blessing during COVID.
Congressman Armstrong?
Well, I use my rural roots, but I agree. I've had more family dinners in a year. It's one of the few benefits that we've had. But I learned to shoot a traditional longbow. I needed something to do, and so I have a longbow, and I shoot it, and I'm not very good at it yet, but it's something I've always wanted to do, so I learned how to do it.
Those of us on Zooms, we're always looking for fun facts. I would say, Congressman, you sort of win with the best fun fact there. Congressman Kelly Armstrong, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, thank you for joining Axios.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And now we'll go across the highway to Axios CEO Jim Vandehei.
Thank you very much, Mikey. It's now my pleasure to bring you a conversation with Holly Harris, who's the president and executive director of the Justice Action Network and an expert on criminal justice reform. Holly, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the rare bipartisan issues has been criminal justice reform. Some progress was made, again, in a bipartisan way under President Trump. Let's look at what was accomplished last year, what needs to be accomplished this year, and then let's really dig into the early signs that we're seeing from Joe Biden. So help us think about what was the most substantial thing done last year.
Well, I mean, obviously, we have been able, it was during the Trump administration, we were able to move forward in a bipartisan way with the First Step Act, which was a prison and sentencing reform bill, a groundbreaking bill, but it was just that, a first step. And, of course, we also were able to pass the Fair Chance Act, which opened up federal employment to people with records. And we continue to move forward. I've been a bit concerned about the acidic political environment, but it does appear now with the bipartisan cooperation between Hakeem Jeffries and Representative Kelly Armstrong with this Equal Act, which will finally and fully eliminate the sentencing disparity between crack offenses and cocaine offenses. It does appear like that bill is gaining momentum And I think that's going to be either the bill that moves this year, or it will be the foundation of a package that could have some other elements. I know that Mike Lee and Dick Durbin are soon to introduce another fair sentencing bill that will include more aggressive sentencing reforms. And then, Chuck Grassley has an excellent bill that prohibits the use of acquitted conduct in sentencing. A lot of people don't realize this, but at the federal level, when you are sentenced after you've been convicted, prosecutors can actually use information about activity that what you were actually acquitted of in order to, get a longer sentence. And so, obviously, we think that's incredibly unfair. And Chuck Grassley has a bill that would eliminate that. So there's a lot of really good pieces, good bipartisan pieces. And I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to marry some of these priorities and really get to a place where we have a very strong sort of second step package.
When it's early in the Joe Biden administration, but there's been things that have been done through executive order, some hiring decisions that have been made. How should we think about the early actions by the Biden administration in relations to criminal justice reform?
Look, we always want more, but I would say by comparison, he's done a great job. Already his administration has rescinded the charging memo that Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General, issued that requires federal prosecutors to charge at the highest levels, regardless of the circumstances of a particular case. The Biden administration has rescinded that. They've also discontinued the use of for-profit prisons, which is really great because it removes that perverse profit incentive, to throwing people behind bars. And then they opened up PPP access to small business owners with records. I mean, that's a third of the small business owners in this country who were previously prohibited from receiving, emergency funds, to help continue their small businesses. So, and those are the people who really needed that money the most. So they've done a great job. Obviously, a lot of the nominations that he's made to lead the Department of Justice, we think are very good, particularly Vanita Gupta, who previously led the leadership conference. She was a very dear friend of mine, was part of the original 7 big groups that created this bipartisan coalition at the federal level. And I'm very hopeful that her nomination will move forward, and hopefully we'll pick off a couple of Republicans who'll be willing to confirm her.
Anything that you think the Biden administration is getting wrong or hasn't moved quickly enough on?
Absolutely. So there was a memo that was issued by the Trump administration just as those officials were walking out the door. And what this memo would do is it would require all of those individuals that the Trump administration had placed on home confinement during COVID, had safely moved to home confinement. This memo would require all of those individuals to go back to prison. These are people who have moved on with their lives, who are improving their education, they've gotten jobs, reconnected with their families. And so obviously we need the Biden administration to rescind that legal memo immediately.
And if you step back for a moment, it's fascinating to look at the arc of criminal justice reform, or even just how people thought about sort of safety and law enforcement. And we had a long period of time where the cool thing in politics was to be as tough as possible on criminals or alleged criminals of all kinds. And little by little, you're seeing a kind of a massive bipartisan sea change. You're seeing decriminalization, at least of marijuana, in many, many states. Do you think this ultimately ends with decriminalization of most drugs up to a certain quantity, that will be sort of the final coda in terms of the war on drugs?
Look, it's important to note that we're coming up on the 50-year anniversary of the war on drugs. It was the summer of '71, the year of your birth, that President Nixon talked about how drug abuse was public enemy number one. And ever since, we've been weaponizing our justice system against our own people. And so, I think we're now starting to see that we went way too far in throwing people behind bars. And we see in our own polling, in states like, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and my home Commonwealth of Kentucky, that people get it now. And I would love to be able to say that, people understand that mass incarceration was not the answer for public safety because of a lot of the advocacy that our groups have done. But I think it's because every single American family is now somehow impacted by our broken justice system. We all know someone, a friend, family member, who has served time behind bars or is struggling with addiction issues or mental health issues. And we don't want to throw in the towel on these people. We love them. We want them to get help. And we want them to be able to get jobs and move forward with their lives and support themselves and their families. And so, I think we're in a really good place. Unfortunately, as usual, Washington is always a little bit behind the states, which have really sort of served as our laboratories of democracy for criminal justice reform. And really, I think moving forward, that's where the real meat of reform is going to take place. It's going to be at the state and the local level. And I'm really hopeful that at the federal level, we can start incentivizing states and localities to reduce incarceration and reduce crime and recidivism rates, which is exactly the opposite of what the 94 crime bill did that was signed into law by President Clinton. That incentivized throwing people behind bars. So I'm hopeful we'll do a full 180 and we'll be able to move forward in a smarter way in this country.
Holly, thank you for a fascinating conversation. Thank you to the Justice Action Network for making the broader conversation possible.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Over to you, Russ.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Russell Contreras, the race and justice reporter for Axios, joining you from Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Our final guest is criminal justice reform advocate Matthew Charles, joining us from Nashville, Tennessee. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Russ.
Before we get into your story and talk about your journey to this point, take us back to North Carolina in 1996. What was it like during that time when we have the discrepancy of people selling crack cocaine and powder cocaine?
Okay, I was actually arrested in Clarksville, Tennessee, and the discrepancy between the crack cocaine and powder cocaine was crack cocaine was the drug of choice in the communities of color because it was cheaper. And at that time, powder cocaine was known to be, sold in the suburbs. So we really didn't have a difference of understanding of the two drug types until it came to being arrested for those drug types, and then the sentence differences.
When people were selling crack cocaine in neighborhoods like the one you were in 1996, why were young brothers going to crack cocaine and using that as an economic job at the time?
Well, at the time, I would say that you kind of almost just came out of a recession. Employment wasn't that great, but at the same token, this was actually the drug that was in the area already and being sold by others. So naturally, people just gravitated to that drug type because that was what was being sold and being used in that community.
Now, when you go to prison, you have an epiphany. You start reading the Bible, you start educating yourself. But when did it hit you that you were a victim of a sentencing disparity?
Well, it hit me kind of early on because once I actually was sentenced to 35 years, I was like, that isn't a tremendous amount of time for the crime that I committed. Of course, I take personal responsibility for my wrong actions and the crime that I committed, but I just thought 35 years was too long of a sentence for what I had actually done. And once I actually came to Christ while in the county jail, I just continued to put my faith and hope in God that something would, happen. And then as I crossed over the barrier into federal prison and started working as not only an educational clerk, but also a law librarian, I was able to see the significant difference, not only in my sentence, but in the sentences of others, because there were some others that had 40 years, 60 years, or life sentences purely because it was crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine.
Now, you saw the disparities of folks who were convicted of crack cocaine. Did you ever encounter folks who were convicted of powder cocaine and had lighter sentences?
Oh, yes, they were coming in, about a day with lighter sentences. As a matter of fact, even in my own situation, I was sentenced at base offense level 38. Had it been for powder cocaine, it would have been base offense level 18. for the amount of crack cocaine that I was held accountable for. So people came in with sentences, and at that time, there was a war on drugs. And because the war on drugs allowed a person that had a criminal history category like me that had 50 grams or more to be sentenced to 30 years to life. And the judge imposed a 35-year sentence on me.
Was there also a racial disparity at the time for folks getting convicted of powder cocaine to crack cocaine? Did you see any difference there?
Whenever you say about the racial disparity, I noticed that the majority of those that were arrested, or if not all of them that I seen at the place that I was incarcerated, they were African American. And the people that had the powder cocaine sometimes varied. It varied with those that had both drug types or those that just had the one drug type. But normally, whenever they just had the one drug type, which is powder cocaine, it was normally, Caucasians.
And how does this not prevent you from getting angry at this disparity? You see this disparity in sentencing, both on racial lines and in drugs, the type of drugs that you're being convicted for. How did you not become angry at the situation?
What helped me was the fact that early on, while I was being held in detention, prior to me being sentenced, I actually became a Christian. Once I became a Christian, that allowed me to have hope as well as faith and to carry myself somewhat a little bit different. But as I, like I say, gravitated on to start serving that sentence in federal prison, of course, there were people there that were crying how racist that the law was, and the fact that they had been given a life sentence as opposed to somebody who had been given a 10-year sentence for selling a different type of drug. So with me, it all settled down in the fact that I became a Christian. I had faith. I was hoping for a better day, and I just consistently tried to walk out that new Christian life that I was now living.
And you were the first person released via the First Step Act. You could have walked away and gone on with your life, but you are remaining an advocate for others who are victims of this sentencing disparity. Why is that?
Because it's important that not only did I remember what held me bound for so long, because I was sentenced in excess of 20 years just because of the disparity between the two drug types. But there are people that are still incarcerated, as I stated, they have 40 years, 60 years, or life sentences. And with the life sentences, they're never going to get out unless something changes. And they shouldn't have those life sentences simply because the drug type that they sold was crack cocaine, and they sold it during the time when there was a misunderstanding of crack cocaine and the fear behind it that caused it to be at 100-to-1 ratio. Even though now it's at 18-to-1 ratio, still a lot of people that are locked in with the life sentences are still locked into a 100-to-1 ratio. But more so also because in 2016, I was released after I filed a petition to have my sentence reduced to the 18-to-1 ratio. And at that time, it wasn't made retroactive, so I was sent back to prison to serve an additional 10 years, not that I committed any new offenses. Well, while I went back, the First Step Act passed in 2018, and I was the first person released January 3rd, 2019, because the First Step Act had an amendment in it making retroactive those 2010 sentencing guideline changes, changing the drug ratio to 18-to-1.
In our final moments we have here, some politicians will say, okay, there's a disparity. Let's make the penalties for powder cocaine just as tough as crack cocaine. Is that the answer?
That's never the answer. As a matter of fact, to me, it's like not only absurd, but it's offensive because for 35 years, you allowed people of color, African Americans, blacks, to be sentenced to a significant longer sentence. And now that it has been made known nationally that there's this disparity between the two drug types, and it has gravely affected the African American community or communities of color, now you want to raise the powder cocaine level. Well, that creates a whole new level of racial inequities. One, it exposes one's heart, saying now that you don't want to right what you've already done wrong and acknowledge now it's wrong, you just want to raise powder cocaine. So now you're going to have two sets of prisoners. Those that have been incarcerated already for powder cocaine offenses going to have less time than those now coming in with powder offenses for no real reason except the fact that you didn't want to correct the bias racial disparity between those two drug types. So to me, it's offensive. You know what I mean? To me, it's not a corrective measure. To me, lowering it down to 1-to-1 is the only plausible or logical thing to do.
Mr. Charles, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
All right, thank you too, Russ. I appreciate you. So.
And now let's go to Mike Allen for our final Why It Matters question and answer segment. Mike, how are you doing?
Fantastic, Russ. And thank you for your coverage of this issue on Axios and for these great conversations today. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and one that really struck me. They said, when will members of law enforcement respect people of color? What's the point in changing the law if you're not going to get that respect?
One of the things activists have said for years is that law enforcement has to reflect the communities they police. So if you're looking at Ferguson or Houston, Texas, or Albuquerque, there has to be demographic parity. You have to have leadership that's in place that feels part of these communities. Look, you can bring people in, bring a top police officer with a lot of good pedigree, a lot of good education. But if this person does not understand the community and does not have those relations, it could be a disaster very quickly. In places like Albuquerque and Los Angeles, there is an effort to recruit from within, by within. And what that means is that these people have to come from the community, understand it, so that there's a partnership. Without that, it becomes an us versus them, and it always ends in a very violent and disastrous way.
So, Russ, you've covered criminal justice issues for a long time, Boston Globe, AP now, in your role as race and justice reporter for Axios. What's your sense, one of our audience members asked, of the role that business has to play here?
Business has to get involved whenever these issues come to the forefront. In places like Albuquerque and Denver, where you've had concerns about the police, business has stepped up and said, look, we need to have good community relations with police and the community, because if you don't, that hurts efforts to attract business to grow in cities. In places like Albuquerque or Dallas or, say, Mobile, Alabama, if you are trying to bring a company, a high-tech company with young families, but there are concerns that if you go there, there are not good community relations with law enforcement, it discourages investment. So businesses do have a role, not only just have a role, they have an obligation to get involved to make sure that communities are at peace with law enforcement and people feel safe, because without that, you cannot have a constructive business climate. You cannot have people who come in and feel safe, and you won't have areas of growth.
I've covered these issues going back to the Richmond Times Dispatch, and I feel like that there is a sine wave of attention to this issue. Now that we have this broad racial reckoning in America, what's your sense of the current consciousness on this issue?
Well, communities of color have always been screaming and been complaining about its relationships with law enforcement. If you go back to the Kerner Commission in the 1960s, former Senator Fred Harris, one of the last surviving members of the Kerner Commission, lives here in Albuquerque, and he says that we've been talking this since 1967. I think the difference now is you have videos like the one of George Floyd's killing hitting you in the face. You can no longer ignore it. This is no longer theoretical or something that you can go into an old textbook. It's real. And you see videos constantly going viral telling you, look, we are screaming. This is a part of systemic racism. This is something we have been complaining about for now 2 generations. It needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed now. And it's very hard not to engage in that conversation when the video is on your cell phone, on your computer, on your tablet, and on the nightly news.
And that helps explain why we now have both parties engaged, that it's one of the very, very few bipartisan issues. When you're not spending money, it might be the only one.
Yes, exactly. And we've seen bipartisanship at a local level when cities have to confront this. You may have a nonpartisan city council or a town council, but it gets you hit. Residents go to their elected officials and say, you need to address this. Partisan politics taken out. Yes, some people may be more pro-law enforcement, want to take another stance, but when it hits you in the face and you have to look at solutions, it no longer becomes a partisan issue. It becomes a future issue.
Russ, we're getting the hook here, so thank you for your coverage, and you're going to have the last word, but I have to compliment you on the vintage typewriter.
Thank you. And I've tried to match my T-shirt with it. So I hope that was something that caught your eye. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. And thank you for our sponsor, Justice Action Network, for making this event possible. For more information or to sign up for newsletters, visit axios.com/newsletters or go to the Axios app. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on axios.com.